We are so thrilled to have you join us here. So I am Adonia Lugo. For anybody who I haven't met, I am the Equity Research Manager at the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our very first online mini-symposium, which is about Ciclovía at 50. So let's go to the land acknowledgement slide. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize that as a land grant institution, UCLA acknowledges and honors the sacrifice of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovaangar, the land upon which the UCLA campus and this space now stand. Next slide. So what is an online mini-symposium? You all who are joining us today are helping us to figure it out. This is an experiment with bringing the atmosphere of our annual Lake Arrowhead Symposium down from the mountain and online. So we are trying out a format where we start with some content. We're actually going to have 2 sessions, and then we're going to go into breakouts at the tail end of the 2.5 hours today. We'll have a break right around, what time is our break? So you can plan on that if you need to. Break around 10:15 a.m. We'll be aiming for that break time. And then we'll come back for our second session and then go into our breakouts. But you know, we're trying things out. We really want to give opportunities for our participants to join the conversation. So there will be some Q&A after each component of the session. And then when we go into the breakouts, there'll be more opportunities for engagement with speakers. So we want to thank our sponsors, Metro, WSP, the California Air Resources Board, and the National Center for Sustainable Transportation are all great supporters of the Arrowhead Symposium this year, and we appreciate their support as we try out this new kind of engagement. So next, I'm going to go through what we're going to do today. So Ciclovía at 50, changing street cultures across the world. For those of you who are aware, the open streets concept that is now very popular around the world in large part gets its origins from the Ciclovía, which translates roughly as bikeway, that was developed in Bogotá, Colombia, starting in 1974. So the event there has had a long life. We're going to hear some details about it from some of our speakers today. But this December 15th, there is a plan to have a 50th anniversary celebration in Bogotá to mark, you know, what has been a long, just unprecedented period of experimentation with car-free streets. And as the Ciclovía traveled around and really getting that global boost after about 2008, it's taken shape differently in different cities. And so that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is, you know, what is the concept? What was its kind of its origin, you know, in terms of meaning, and then how has it taken shape? So the first session is going to be along those lines. I'm going to start out with a wonderful conversation with my fellow co-founder of our Ciclovía in Los Angeles, CicLAvia, Aaron Paley. And then we're going to hear some presentations by scholars, all of whom happen to be Colombian, about what Ciclovía has meant in Bogotá and in other contexts as well, and some current research on how people use the event in Bogotá. Then after our break, we're going to have a roundtable discussion focused on Los Angeles as a case study. So how does a successful open street event take shape, looking at some of the political, planning, cultural, and community components that are all necessary to build that, and thinking a little bit about what would it take for us to be able to celebrate a Ciclovía 50 in 2060 in Los Angeles. Then we'll shift into our breakouts where, again, you get to engage with speakers from the different sessions. We'll talk more about who will be in which room when we get there. And then we're going to wrap things up so that you're out of here by 11:30 Pacific time. And again, so fun to have so many people joining us today for this experiment and to celebrate this upcoming anniversary. So without further ado, as I mentioned, Aaron and I were lucky to be on the founding team that developed Ciclovía here in Los Angeles. And, to be clear, it was not the two of us. It took a team. And there's a whole long story about, the 2 years of organizing that it took to make the event happen. But then Aaron went on to become the founding executive director of Ciclovía as an organization, really worked incredibly hard to steward the event through its first few years. And so I'm excited to get to be in dialogue with you today, Aaron. So just a little more background about Aaron Paley. He's been engaged with how Angelenos think about and use their city for more than 4 decades. He co-founded Community Arts Resources, or CARS, with Katie Bergen in 1989 to create unique experiences where art, culture, community, and civic life collide. Combining his deep knowledge of Los Angeles with an innovative approach to urban planning, Paley and his firm have produced more than 500 ephemeral events throughout the region. And as the founding director of Ciclovía, Aaron was instrumental in turning LA County into the largest center for open streets events in the country. He's been involved with permanent public space improvements from Honolulu to Houston, and we so appreciate having you here with us this morning, Aaron.
Oh, so great to be here and in dialogue with you, because I feel like the spark for Ciclovía is actually embedded in your email to me in 2009 saying, hey, we're working on that. So
yeah, for background for folks, so a really grassroots effort to start thinking about what a Ciclovía in LA could look like got started in the fall of 2008. And a few months after that, I was directed to this article in Los Angeles Magazine, where some different LA thinkers and creators had been asked, what's their advice for the mayor? How could Mayor Villaraigosa really do something different with our culture here? And this art producer guy, I don't think at the time I really understood what art production was, but said that a Ciclovía was a good idea. And so we thought, well, we're talking about doing a Ciclovía, let's join forces. And so I reached out to Aaron, and one of my favorite things about that is that we then got to start meeting as a committee at the Wiltern building, where CARS offices were located. And yeah, have just really enjoyed collaborating with you since then.
Well, I learned I had never produced a quote unquote bicycle event. I didn't have a bicycle at the time as well. So I like to say this is when bikes met cars. Our company, Community Arts Resources, our nickname is CARS. And, I was working on the idea of creating a long linear festival. I wanted to work on the river. Actually, I wanted to activate the LA River, all 51 miles of it. And this is because I had received a fellowship, which gave me funding to think about how public space could be engaged more how could I bring the activation of public space in LA to a higher level? So at that point, I had been working on public space activations for almost 30 years. And this Durfee Foundation has this thing called the Stanton Fellowship. And I said, I want to take the activation of public space to another level. And so I got this funding and I started exploring ideas. And the first idea I had was to activate the LA River. And so I started talking to LA River planners and having these deep discussions about the river, which is an incredible public asset in Los Angeles and goes through all these neighborhoods. But the Durfee Foundation insisted that I find an international model to emulate. And they said, we need to bring best practices to Los Angeles. And I kept saying to them, there is no festival of a dry concrete river anywhere in the world. Like we're going to be inventing this from scratch. And Claire Peeps, to her credit, said, I don't care, Aaron, you have to figure it out. Find one. So I was doing research. Oh, that's better. Thank you. So I was doing research on international models and couldn't find anything. I looked in Australia, North Africa, Italy, and I was speaking to an urban planner who was working on the LA River. This was like, I think in March or April of 2009. And he said, well, and I was saying, well, I just think I need a long linear festival example. And he said, well, you should be looking at the example of Ciclovía in Bogotá. And I said, could you repeat that? Because I had no idea what he was saying and what he was referring to. And he said, well, there's this really great streets film that came out, had just come out. And I watched this film and I came home and I said to my wife, Judith, I said, we are going to Bogota. And she said, no way. Like I said, yes, we are. This is it. This is the light bulb. Like we don't need to just use the river, which is a great public space, but the genius of that I saw in that 7-minute street film was that we could use any street anywhere. And it just unlocked this key in my brain. And I thought, this is genius, because cars had produced not open streets events, but we had produced block parties, we had produced parades, we had taken over streets before, but it wasn't the open streets model. And I literally had to go to Bogota to see it for the first time to understand what it was, because even though I had thought I had seen everything, all the different possible festival models at that moment, I really hadn't. And this was a whole other model. And I'm always telling people who haven't seen an open streets event in person, it's not like anything you've ever seen before. You just need to witness it because it really is different.
Right. Yeah. I think that for some folks who haven't experienced it, it kind of depends on the context in which you hear about it, right? So in the US, it's really circulated as a transportation event, right? It's helping to give us a place to experiment with moving differently, moving outside of cars, which here in Southern California, here in LA, that is really the mode in which people feel familiar and comfortable. And so what is it like to get outside of your car and, and not just you getting outside of your car, but removing that pressure point of
Right.
what it's like to be traveling through the street with vehicular traffic. And so that how do we help support the shift to sustainable transportation element, I think really gets the spotlight. But what I hear you saying, Aaron, is how important it is to think about these other aspects of the model, where it really is about public space, and it's about how we interact in public space, and how we relate to, even with hearing about how you had been focusing on the river, how we interact with our local environment and ecology, right? That there's more to this story than just human interaction. Public space includes these other
Absolutely.
living elements.
I mean, I just want to say that, I've seen maybe 6 different cities, no, more than that, maybe a dozen cities beyond LA who've done open streets events. But I kind of think that the LA model is successful because we looked at Ciclovia in a bigger context of not just about transportation, which is really important, but as public space, like how do people see each other? How do people meet each other? How can people, as Romel Pascual, who's going to speak later, who's now the executive director of Ciclovía, talks how people can actually have a conversation in the streets together without the sounds of traffic. So that's really important, as well as the idea of that, we were a company that produced arts events and cultural events, and using arts and culture and integrating it into Ciclovía has been there from the beginning. It's something that I think also adds to it, thinking about public health as well, reduce, the impact on the environment. And I just want to, pay homage to Jaime Ortíz Mariño, who is the founder of Ciclovía, whose slide is up on the screen, and who was Adonia's inspiration, as well as mine, who really inspired me as well, with his amazing insight and perspective to actually bring this idea forth in 1974.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So we have some information on a slide here about Jaime, who, as Aaron said, he was part of a group called ProCicla that produced the first Ciclovia event in Bogotá in 1974. And so the slide shows a picture of our friend Jaime. It shows a picture of a newspaper that was covering the first events that were going on in Bogotá. And there's also an image of something, I believe Jaime created this image. When I met him in 2008, he had a perspective on what this event meant beyond transportation in a way that was very exciting to me and also resonated with my interest in looking at race and class and power in terms of how we interact in street spaces. So this is an event coming from the global south, right? Like what we typically term the global south. Colombia is, it's not in Europe. It's not one of the places that historically has been looked to for street design models in terms of how to have more human-centered streets. And when I met with Jaime, who at the time was working in the mayor's office in Bogota in 2008, he explicitly focused on that in a way that was unexpected to me. He said, this is meaningful, that this is an event coming from the global south and circulating in the global north. And that for me was, really central to understanding that in his conception of what this event was about, again, it goes way beyond transportation. There are problems with how we interact with each other, right? We haven't necessarily gone to a place with our societies where we treat each other well in street spaces. So that could mean in terms of harassment of women, in terms of how we use vehicles to impose domination on those around us, and then all the safety effects that come from those attitudes. And so the Ciclovia was a way to get people active. So, focusing on spaces for physical health, but also to think about public health in this social sense of, how should we be interacting with each other and grappling with this kind of power, this even in a colonial framework. So this image that I know is hard to see, but I just wanted to include it so I wouldn't forget to mention it. Jaime showed me when I met him in the summer of 2008. He drew this image for me, and so this is a much more developed version of it for something he called La Una, which is Unión de Naciones Asoleadas, the Union of Sunlit Nations. And so he said, instead of calling it the global south, what if we centered our world vision on this part of the world that shares certain features, right? And how does that shift our conversation to say that instead of the global south, it's La Una, this union. And so really just want to highlight that the seed in terms of whatever impact a founder's thinking has on an event 50 years on, the seeds were there for considering how Ciclovia could be a space to really reshape society. And so, when I talked to Jaime recently, he was intending to be part of this panel today, but unfortunately has had health issues, and we all are sending him best wishes. He talked about how Ciclovia is the world's largest outdoor classroom. So really focusing on how these spaces can be catalysts for change and learning and giving people opportunities to try something new.
I would love to pick up on that. I mean, I think that when we do Ciclovia, and I completely agree with Jaime and all of these things, and I think it's so important that this idea comes from Bogota. And when I talk about this, and especially when we were setting this up in the first couple of years, people were always giving us examples about London and Paris, and especially Copenhagen and Amsterdam. And this is how how we need to think about our cities. And this was something that had come up in my whole life as a native Angelino, of always thinking about these cities that people put forth as real cities, and that LA wasn't one of them, right? And that we didn't have anything to
Mhm.
contribute to the urban planning dialogue because we weren't like those other great cities. And what's fabulous is when you go to Bogotá is to see how much it actually looks like Los Angeles and how much they have in common. And I think Jaime has granted Los Angeles to be part of La Una. He says we get a pass. But what this does is that we get to work with something that's not based on a model that we can't recreate. We can't recreate Copenhagen. We're not a European scaled city. And Bogota did it first and said, like, you don't need to think about it in that scale, and you can actually think out of the box. And in Los Angeles, as the world's largest outdoor classroom, as Jaime likes to say, every time Ciclovia happens, it's a vision of the future. It's actually a vision to Angelinos of what their city could look like tomorrow if we had the political will to change our streets. So it's there every time it happens. It's like, look, here's the future, take it. And I'm hoping that we have a whole generation of children who grow up with Ciclovia, as I think has happened in Bogota, which is why Colombians all over the world are like the main progenitors and ambassadors for this idea. Like, I think that after a generation of people grow up with this, they're going to just take the idea of using the streets for other purposes besides cars for granted and say, like, why can't we do this more often, except instead of like once a month, which is about the rate that's happening in LA County. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into talking about one of another of our collaborators who couldn't join us today, but who has been an incredible ambassador of the Ciclovia concept, specifically on the African continent, right? What you're saying in terms of the what we get to witness in Bogota with 50 years of this event, that's several generations of people who've grown up with their streets being used in this way. So one of those people who is Colombian, but has been working on ciclovias in other contexts is Marcela Guerrero Casas. And she is the co-founder of the organization Local South. She co-founded Open Streets Cape Town in South Africa. That's where she's based. And she also, through that work, helped to create a network of African cities that do open street events called Open Streets Africa. And so she is just constantly working on cultural exchanges. How do you bring people from very different cities together in order to, support them using this model where it makes sense, but then recognizing that it will take a different shape in a different context. And so the way she talks about the Ciclovia is that it's a concept from the global south that has been utilized, adapted, and sometimes reimagined, giving a way to think about streets and public space differently in cities from Addis Ababa to Mexico City and so many in between. So just wanted to also, recognize Marcela's role in terms of helping to maintain a transnational dialogue about this event, based on having grown up in Ciclovia spaces in Colombia.
And it also highlights the network. I mean, there really is a network of people who work on open streets. And so when I was working at Ciclovia and was the director, we hosted an international conference of open streets events in 2013 in Los Angeles. We had only done, I think, 5 Ciclovias up until that point. And Marcela contacted us and said, I want to come, but she didn't have the money. And we helped subsidize her travel to LA so that, Marcela and I are now very good friends, but she loved seeing the LA model and seeing how we developed it, because she, of course, had grown up with it in Bogota, but she was trying to figure out how to start it now in Cape Town. And the conversations that we had about how Ciclovia started in Los Angeles and the issues and the obstacles we faced and how we worked through them were very helpful for her as she was developing Cape Town Open Streets. And that's that kind of model of open streets organizations and cities around the world helping each other is part of what makes this a really strong international movement, I hope.
Yeah, agreed. And I personally feel really fortunate to get to be part of that international dialogue. You know, as a fairly, I'm an anthropologist, but I'm not one of those anthropologists who spend a lot of time living abroad. I do my work primarily in Los Angeles, where I live. And it is just, it's such a gift to be able to be in dialogue with people who are working on this event in different contexts. Well, we are going to have to wrap up our conversation, Erin, so we can get into our presentations. But we welcome participants to put questions in the Q&A. We're going to have a question and answer session after our presentations in about 30 minutes. And then you can also stay on and join a breakout session where Erin and I and Paolo will be present. So any closing thoughts, Erin, before we go into the presentations?
Just that if you're thinking about, to anyone who watches this and is thinking about bringing this to your hometown, if you don't have an open streets thing, I like the Ciclovía model where there's an anthropologist, an arts producer, a traffic engineer, a graphic designer, a political activist, a climate activist, all that very diverse group of founders who maybe there were about a dozen of us who are all volunteering to bring this idea together, create strength. So find a network and find some allies and make it happen.
Great. I love the call to action. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you, Adonia.
So,
always a pleasure.
We are going to hear from some scholars who have done research on ciclovias in different contexts. And I will share some info about each of our scholars before we queue them up. But just so everybody's aware, we're first going to hear from Professor Sergio Montero, who is based at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Then we're going to hear from Olga Sarmiento, who is a professor in the Department of Public Health in the School of Medicine at Universidad de los Andes, which is in Bogotá. And then we will hear from Paula Castañeda Londoño, who is an assistant professor in history and geography at Universidad de los Andes. So, Sergio, you're going to be our first presenter, and I will say a little more about you as you get your slides ready to go. Sergio is the inaugural director of the Institute for Inclusive Economies and Sustainable Livelihoods at the University of Toronto at Scarborough. He's interested in place-based and inclusive approaches to reimagine local economic development and urban and regional planning. His research is often comparative and emphasizes thinking from the global south and from the peripheries of economic development. And his presentation today is about worlding or mundializando la ciclovía. Sergio, I'm so glad that we get to have you here as a speaker. You've really influenced my thinking over the years, and I'll hand things over to you.
Hi, Adonia. No, thank you for all you've done already, like writing. I also read your book when I was finishing my dissertation. It was very inspiring. And all you've done now with CicLAvia, but also maintaining this network that you were talking about before, which I think is very important to understand also this global mobilization of Bogotá is really through people. And so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history of Ciclovía in Bogotá, but also that moment when the Ciclovía becomes worlded or becomes like a world model, because it's interesting how even though the Ciclovía as a policy has been happening since the 70s, it's in a moment of time in the early 2000s that it sort of like exploded. So for me, it was always a question of why certain ideas, you could have great ideas, but at some point they become and they travel a lot, but they could also be anonymous. So I'll talk a little bit about that, which has been a lot of my research. I'll speak in English, but I'll have my presentation in Spanish. So hopefully that would work. So, I mean, I don't have to tell a lot about Ciclovía at this point. You've basically summarized very well what it is. It's a program that happens every Sunday in Bogotá from 7 a.m. till 2 p.m. About 1 million people participate, but I feel like since COVID, it's become even more popular. So I see now figures that it's about 1.5 million every Sunday. So imagine this is like twice the population of Amsterdam that takes the streets of Bogotá every Sunday. It's also been a model that has been replicated especially in the last 20 years. The first one that I saw when I was still finishing my dissertation at Berkeley was in 2008 in San Francisco. And I was just coming from Bogota about doing research there, and I discovered that at the time it was not so known. And then I came back, and then San Francisco started doing Ciclovía, which they called Sunday Streets at the time. And in the history of Sunday Street, they also recognized the origins in Bogota. So I thought that was very interesting, and that was one of the first things that I decided I need to understand this. Like, how is it that this policy that has been happening in Bogota for so long now is becoming so popular also in the US? And this travel, as you were saying, from the global south to the global north, how does it work? Then obviously Los Angeles also did Ciclovía, which was very interesting to me because in my imagination of Los Angeles as the capital of the car, that Bogota was being used to challenge the automobile paradigm. Was very interesting for me also to learn more about how the model also traveled from Bogota to Los Angeles. And then Guadalajara, Mexico, which has become the second largest ciclovia in the world after Bogota. So now it's a relatively recent program. I think it's started in 2006 or 2010, I'm not sure now, but it's not so old. And then it's now one of the most popular ones. I think it's about 600,000 people every Sunday. That also uses Vía Recreativa, it's called in Guadalajara. So I was also very interested in looking at figures and like, so how is this, like how many ciclovías there are in the world? And there's like one paper that Olga, who's going to be speaking later today, wrote that was very useful to sort of like understand this like epidemic, as like some public health scholars call it, epidemic of ciclovías, like how the Ciclovía program expanded, especially as we are seeing in the 2000s. In 2015, there were more than 400 ciclovías. Probably now it's more than 600. We don't have numbers, but that's what I'm guessing. And so I want also to tell you a little bit more about there's different histories of Ciclovía. I want to touch on like 4 very important moments for the program in Bogota. So one of the first moments, and Adonia also mentioned it already, is the moment of the experiment of Ciclovía. And I like the word experiment because that's the word that was used by Jaime Ortíz and some of the other members of the ProCicla. It's very important to understand that origins of Ciclovía is sort of like a citizen-led program. So it was not the government then institutionalized the program after, but the origins of it was this group of 3 bike enthusiasts that wanted to do an experiment to also counteract the suburbanization and the automobile center paradigm that they were observing that it was starting to happen in Bogota as well in the 70s. So it's important both to recognize the citizen origins of Ciclovía, but also the political origins of Ciclovía. And actually, the first name of Ciclovía was called the Great Pedal Demonstration. And it was really a demonstration on bikes to complain about pollution, to complain about the car becoming the dominant paradigm. So it was really it was recreation, but it was also politicizing the bicycle. Then they did a couple of experiments. They did it in 74 and then again one day in 75. And then the mayor of Bogota at the time became very interested in institutionalizing the program. So then is when the program becomes like a policy, a public program. And it's interesting to also know that this is happening in the context of the oil crisis. So this is happening in a moment in which cities are growing in a suburban mode. Before the 73, it was fine because oil was cheap, but then with the oil crisis, then and the rise of environmental activism in the 70s, this combines to sort of like create a movement of people that are really worried about cities depending on cars. So that is also the global context in which Ciclovía emerge. It's also interesting that Jaime Ortíz, one of the founders of Ciclovía in Bogota, had studied in Cleveland in the US for 1 year. And so he became in contact with environmental activism of the US in the 70s and then came back. And some of these ideas, so the ideas have been flowing also north and south between the US and Bogota also. That's also a very interesting thing. And another connection with LA, I was thinking about this, but in the 70s, there are several books from Bogota planners that see Los Angeles as the anti-model that Bogota did not want to become this sort of like suburban sprawl city. So it's also always been in dialogue between the US and Bogota in a way. And then we have this moment in the late 80s where suddenly the oil started to go down, prices were again not a worry, and sort of like it lost this sort of like environmental activism and the worries about oil and so urbanization lost momentum, and therefore Ciclovía also lost momentum and almost disappeared in the late 80s, only to then be rediscover again in the 90s, not rediscover, it never really stopped happening in Bogota, but it was sort of like less public investment. And then in the 90s with, especially in the 95 with Antanas Mockus as mayor of Bogota, then it becomes this sort of like renaissance of Bogota in the 90s of one of the most also a crisis also really in Bogota with homicide rates like over the roof. And so a new generation of mayors that came in the mid-90s in Bogota that actively experimented with public space as a way to regain citizen trust, but also with the higher levels of violence that were happening in Bogota and in Colombia at the time. I just want to show you a graph here of how the homicide rates in Bogota in 94 were at a really high maximum, and how during the 90s these levels start to decrease. And this also has to do with some of this mayors, especially Antanas Mockus, but also Gil Peñalosa, who's the brother of Enrique Peñalosa, became the director of the Parks and Recreation under the first administration of Antanas Mockus. And then public space and Ciclovía became a central element of their strategy to regain citizens' trust and the role of public space in creating a space of interaction, especially in a city that is highly segregated and unequal as Bogota. So then after that, in the 2000s, what we start to see is sort of like the started to replication of Bogota in many other cities around the world. And that's at the moment that I caught a lot of my attention, and I wanted to understand how is this possible and who is behind this. And as always, there's always people and there's always networks of people that allow for the movement of Ciclovía, for the expansion of Ciclovía around the world, which is what I call the worlding of Ciclovía. So in one paper that I wrote about this, I distinguish between 4 key actors in the worlding of Ciclovía. The first one are sort of like the ambassadors of Bogota. So like the mayors of Bogota. Bogota has now a tradition of a lot of mayors that then after they leave office, they go and give talks around the world. And so Enrique Peñalosa and his brother, Gil Peñalosa, were very important storytellers. Also, one can see this as like the story of Bogota and how this story was really persuasive and convincing for many mayors, but also activists around the world to try something like that. But then this also coincides with the rise of sustainable transportation. So the change in transportation paradigms from sort of like a more engineered perspective when they were privileging, how to move as fast as possible from point A to point B, to the idea of sustainable mobility, the idea that we have to care also not just about speed and time, but we also have to care about how different people experience transportation differently, how we need to care about the environment, the impact of transportation in CO2 emissions. So a lot of funding, transnational funding became available in the 2000s, especially since the mid-2000s, to sort of like fund initiatives that promoted sustainable transportation. And therefore, the expansion of Ciclovía also is linked to this availability of funding, but it's also linked to a network, again, of people. And so this, for instance, this association that was called the Ciclovías Recreativas de las Américas became a very interesting node of people. Also, a lot of people coming from public health. This also coincides with a shift in public health into looking more into cities as causes of public health problems. And so as public health advocates became more interested in cities, and as sustainable transportation activists become also more well-funded, then a lot of sort of like cross-pollination between public health activism and sustainable transportation activism happened. And Ciclovía became a great example for that, for both public health and transportation activists. So a network start to, be generated around the world, but especially in the Americas, to help other cities to do Ciclovía. So, for instance, there was a manual that were produced by scholars, but also a collaboration between scholars and activists. And so and then the other actors that was very important is how people that start to replicate Ciclovía then became ambassadors themselves, right? And in a way, you two guys are this kind of example of people who created a Ciclovía in Los Angeles and then became ambassadors of Ciclovía around the world. Another person that I can think about this is the founder of Sunday Street in San Francisco, Susan King, who left after she left Sunday Street, then became kind of like a consultant for a lot of American cities that wanted to implement the Ciclovía. So that also become a very important way in which Ciclovías are spread, especially in the US, but around the world. And then the video that Aaron was just mentioning has been very important. I keep hearing many cities or activists or mayors that saw this street films video and then sort of like became convinced or persuaded that they needed to do something like that. So like the role of the social media and videos like this, I cannot, express how important they were in the expansion of Ciclovía. So some people, sometimes it happens what Aaron just described. People see the video and then they want to go to Bogotá to see it in real. But some people just saw the video and then replicated the program in their city. So I'm going to leave it there. But I'm happy also to answer questions today. But also if you want to write, anyone is interested, want to write me, or there are more details about this history in this paper that I'm also happy to share.
Thank you, Sergio. I so appreciate you being able to have a abbreviated overview of all of this fabulous research you've been doing for years. And of course, the street film, Clarence Eckerson Jr.'s film about the Ciclovía in Bogotá was how I learned about the concept as well. It was incredibly powerful with how it circulated. So please do put questions for Sergio in the Q&A, and we will get to that after our other presenters. But we are next going to hear from someone who has been a wonderful thinker in terms of looking at the public health aspects of Ciclovías, Olga Lucía Sarmiento Dueñas. We are so fortunate to have her here today. She's going to get her slides up, and so as I mentioned earlier, she's at Universidad de los Andes. Her transdisciplinary research focuses on the relationship between the built environment, policy, and health, with an emphasis on inclusive and sustainable community programs in Latin America. She's currently the co-principal investigator on the Sal Urbal Climate Project, the Escala Project, the Implementation Research Project in Bogotá and Maputo, On the Way to School Project, and the GAC PAQ Project. She stays very busy in her research. She received a life distinction from the Ministry of Sports of Colombia and the Institute of Sports and Recreation of Bogotá for promoting healthy behaviors in Colombia through academic work, particularly on the Ciclovías of Colombia. So thank you so much, Olga, for joining us today, and I will hand things over to you. And get yourself off mute.
I'm gonna take out my video just because I don't have the best internet today, okay? And then I'll put it up again. So thank you, Adonia, for this invitation. It's actually an honor to be here. So I'm gonna bring the perspective of public health and the study from public health, anthropology, transport experts, social sciences, on the studies on Ciclovía Recreativa and the potential impact on healthy behaviors that we have studied for almost 20 years from here in the city of Bogotá. So I will not only concentrate on Bogotá, but also in the region of Latin America. So as many of you know, we have here the pictures of Ciclovía. So that's what we have seen. So I'm going to start with a map that we made with Sergio a long time ago, and about the inventory of these programs in the world. So worldwide, we have documented almost 500 programs. There's still the same 500 programs because some of them were interrupted during COVID and have not initiated again, but it's a lot of programs, and it's in the 5 continents. And the largest expansion, as Sergio said, occur here and thus, and this, let me put the pointer on this inflection point that you see here, when we see actually more programs in the Americas, especially in North America. Another thing that I also want to underscore is that during the pandemic, we saw at least 90 cities in 20 countries that used that infrastructure, that was Mexico City, that was Bogotá, to create temporary bikeways. So what they learned from the Ciclovía program was so useful, especially for cities like Bogotá or Mexico City, to decrease the congestion in our public transport and to have these temporary bikeways that also promote healthy behavior. So you see that Ciclovía program, an amazing program on Sundays and holidays, but it can also help to expand bike use during the weekday and especially for transport. So it is important to underscore before getting into the healthy behaviors that we are coming from an idea from the most unequal region in the world. And what you see in these maps is the map of Bogotá, Santiago de Cali, also in Colombia, Chile, and Mexico. So we see that we have programs that are socially inclusive programs, but in a very highly unequal and segregated cities. The red here is how segregated Bogotá is, and then you see how the circuit is here. So what we did was to geocode a sample of participants of the program and to see how they move across the city. And we see that we have a program that allows mobility from, in the case of Bogotá, north to south, which is where the richest live, and south where the poorest live. So it's not only the recreation, but also that social inclusion that it's so important to have a better society and a more healthy city. We see that trajectories are higher in the city of Bogotá and in Santiago de Chile, in Santiago de Cali, as compared to Chile and Mexico City. However, we see this mobilization at least once per week in these very unequal cities. So the other element that we have studied and is so important is meeting physical activity. Physical activity is an important, key factor to prevent the most prevalent diseases, morbidity, and mortality that we have in a region, and the Ciclovía allows that. So for those who are not familiar with the guidelines, adults have to do at least 150 minutes per week of physical activity, and this program allows that. We see higher prevalences in New York, in Bogotá, in San Francisco, in Mexico City, but overall, we see that these prevalences are higher than the city prevalences. So at least for a day that many people criticize, but it's only one day, but one day could help us to promote physical activity guidelines, because the guideline says that you can do it at least one day or through all the city. And we have evidence on what we call the weekend warrior, in which we see that those who do physical activity just one day also have less mortality. So this is very important for public health. And we also have studied many populations in the city of Bogotá. So we have studied adults, women, older adults, children, and we see constantly, which is what you see in this graph, that those who use the Ciclovía, who are participants of the Ciclovía, are more likely to be physically active, which is a key behavior, as I said, for promoting physical activity. So I'm going to move to other programs. So you know very well the one that we close the streets, but Ciclovía also has inspired the Play Streets program that it's also very prevalent in the Americas. So we close the streets, we have Play Streets program in the city of Bogotá on Sundays, but it also has moved to neighborhoods, which is very important for this population, the children. So here you have a picture. This is in the Ciclovía, where the children not only are on the corridor that we close, but also on near the corridor for other activities that are culturally acceptable and culturally important for the population of children. So this study that was conducted by my colleagues in Santiago de Chile, they evaluated with pedometer data, objective data, physical activity, and they say that those who have the Play Streets, which is what you see here, have higher probability of meeting physical activity recommendations. And the anthropologist also asked the kids to have drawings, and look how important it is. This is the group of children who go to the play streets, they are playing the streets, and there's the control group who are playing but in front of a screen, which we know is not the healthiest component or behavior that we should be promoting among children. So we also use pedometer, accelerometers among the children in Bogotá, and we found two things that I want to underscore. First, that there's no difference by sex. We see that always boys are more active than girls. We see that all over the world, and in the Ciclovía, we don't see differences. Also, we see that low middle income children are more likely to participate. And very importantly, they have higher minutes of physical activity that is good for your health, but they also have less minutes on sedentary behavior. So instead of being in front of the screens, they are on receiving the sun, they are outside in the streets, they are in outdoor settings that are during the Sundays are less contaminated, promoting healthy behaviors. So I'm going to move to the relationship of what we studied during the pandemic. So you know that also, apart from the Ciclovía, we have one of the largest bikeways routes that we had. And during the Ciclovía, our mobility secretariat had to do something with the public transport, the congestion. So they created these temporary bikeways that you see here. This is in an area where we have the Ciclovía, the 7th Avenue. Then the temporary bikeways, very important, became permanent. And this is where we have the Ciclovía. So that interrelationship between permanent and temporary programs is very important for promoting more sustainable mode of transportation. So we did analysis, and we said we could prevent 145 premature deaths. We're talking about deaths with an economic benefit of 164 million euros. Very important for our policymakers. And my colleagues developed this project in which they evaluated 15 programs in Latin American cities, and they estimated that we could have prevent with our programs on open streets or Ciclovía 363 annual premature deaths with an annual economic impact of $194 million. That for our setting, it's a lot of money. So this is also all their arguments apart from the public health argument that are so important, because this is just preventing deaths due to promoting physical. So lastly, just to end, I want to underscore, and Aaron said that importantly, that it's not only closing the streets. We need to be innovative. We need to have complementary programs. So we have these programs that are programs in which we dance on parks that are close to the Ciclovía program, and are very popular for women and older adults, which is another population in which we want to promote physical activity. So this program in Bogotá was born in 1995, and these are the points around the Ciclovía route, and mostly benefit women who go with their family and their friends. So just to end, some evidence: Recreovía promotes quality of life and life satisfaction, is very important for women. We increase social cohesion. Look at this network. And to end, which is something that also Aaron said, this is not just a program of one sector. This is a network analysis that shows that, of course, in Bogotá, the program that is more central are sports and recreation, but you here have health, security, transport, education, and from the academia, which are here, we are the ones who try to evaluate to promote some lessons that could bring another element like public health in this case. So I just show you some evidence of our Ciclovía that is so important for public health, for women, children, and older adults. They are more faster than what we do evaluation, so there's a call for evaluation. And this evaluation has been able to be conducted thanks to national and international networks. And I want to acknowledge many of our funders of this study. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Olga. So appreciate the depth of your research here. And it's so helpful to have all these starting points for looking at how the impacts are evaluated. It's also really reminding me of what a robust network there is of scholarship on Ciclovías. I, as someone who was working on helping to organize our event in LA while I was doing my PhD dissertation, I got a little bit familiar with it, but I finished in 2013. And so I'm thinking about how much good information has been developed in the last decade. So thank you so much for giving us a quick introduction. And any questions for Olga, put in the Q&A and we will get to those after our next presenter, which will be Paula Castañeda Londoño. Now, Paula is going to get her slides up and she'll be telling us about assessing women's participation in Ciclovía 50 years on. Paula, as I mentioned earlier, is also a professor at Universidad de los Andes. She is a historian and geographer who conducts research on cities and mobility with a focus on bicycle culture in Latin America. And she is going to tell us about this research project she's developing on gender differences in the Ciclovía. She's also working on a virtual exhibition in commemoration of the 50 years of the Ciclovía. Paula is also someone who spearheaded a translation project, and this is how she and I connected a few years ago, working on taking the mobility justice principles that were developed by a US-based network and translating them into Spanish and also Latin American political contexts. So I very much appreciate Paula's hard work in staying involved in transnational dialogues. And I will pass things over to you, Paula.
Unmute myself.
Okay, now we can hear you.
Got it. Okay, so thank you so much, Adonia. Can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yep, we see it.
Yeah.
Wonderful graphics.
Okay. It's Canva. Okay, so thank you so much, Adonia, for organizing, and Phoebe for all of the background work that she has been doing, putting this together. So we just heard some really fantastic research that Sergio and Olga have been doing about Ciclovía. And when I was finishing my PhD, I knew that I wanted to work on Ciclovía because I'm going to respectfully disagree with you, Adonia. I don't think there is enough research about Ciclovía. I think there's a lot of research coming up about open streets around the world. And I think our colleagues in other parts of Latin America have been a little bit more active in researching their own Ciclovía and open streets programs. But I think, and one of my dissatisfactions and motivations behind taking on this research is that I think people here in Bogotá have taken Ciclovía for granted. It's been 50 years. I think the majority of us contemporary, newer generations, as Aaron and you said earlier, we grew up with Ciclovía. So it's always been there. And there's never been this question of how is this changing our city? What potential does it have? And with the 50 years coming up, I wanted to, motivate and sort of trigger these conversations about what is Ciclovía? What does it do for us? And I realized that while Olga and her colleagues have done a huge amount of work, social scientists have been less inclined to research Ciclovía, with the exception here of Sergio and a few others. And obviously my research had taken me down the path of researching women and doing feminist urban research. So my first question was, well, how are women experiencing Ciclovía? And this is where this research project comes along. So we already heard Ciclovía was established in 15 December 1974 to legitimate the bicycle as a form of transport. And today we have a huge program encompassing recreation, physical activity, public space, and active transport. Well, we just heard from Olga about all of the wonderful benefits, but I'm just going to briefly recount them. So we know that it promotes health and leisure time physical activity, that it promotes well-being and quality of life in relation to, being physically active, that it promotes social inclusion and integration and encounters in public space, which is hugely important. It promotes equity through providing spaces of recreation, with the understanding that lower income people have less access to high quality spaces for recreation, and Ciclovía provides that in many ways. One of the things I noticed while I was reviewing the literature and that struck my attention is that it's the space in Bogotá with the highest perception of personal and road safety. And this is a city where people are constantly complaining about how unsafe they feel. So this is really remarkable. And I'm going to return to this at the end of the presentation. And the one book length research that has been done about Ciclovía by Astrid Viviana Rodriguez Cortez highlights like the impacts on public space, the shifting meanings of Ciclovía, which is something that Sergio briefly talked about, how it fits within local concerns, global concerns, and changing discourses about the city. So that's a wonderful and lesser known study that I really like to get back to. But we also know that Ciclovía expresses the social spatial inequalities that exist in the city. So we know that while it is lower income people that attend Ciclovía the most, it is higher income people that are at closest proximity to Ciclovía corridors. We know that environmental quality is not the same throughout Ciclovía. So certain parts of the city have better or worse environmental quality. And this isn't something that's been documented in the literature, but it's something that I've observed in my many trips around the city in Ciclovía, and it's the quality of facilities and how it varies from area to area. So in higher income areas, you have, all of these stands and staff and variety of people, but then there are other parts of the city that are a little bit forgotten. And this is something that I'd like to get on paper and sort of do more less anecdotal conclusions about. And something that struck me as well while I was reviewing the literature is that Ciclovía does express some gender inequalities. And this shouldn't be surprising because the city and the city's programs, have been designed within a patriarchal capitalist system. So it's not surprising that in the studies that have reported on this, only 30% of participants are women, while 70% are men. And we know that lower income women are at higher risk of physical inactivity. So Olga mentioned Ciclovía as one of the complementary programs that draw women to Ciclovía, and that's where we see highest participation of women. But elsewhere in Ciclovía, it would seem that women are not participating as much as men. And these statistics, I found them almost at the footnotes of the papers and the research that I've been reading, and I started asking myself, well, why is this happening? Why are women going to Ciclovía less than men? And for those women who are going to Ciclovía, what are they doing? How are they appropriating the space? Are they doing more than just exercise? How do they perceive the space around them? And there's very little to no research about women in Ciclovía. So the first thing that I thought would be pertinent to tackle is create a sort of like a knowledge base of how women are interacting with Ciclovía. In her book, Astrid Rodriguez says, Ciclovía is a space that has a lot to explore academically. It's important to do some studies with a gender perspective, given that this would reveal the uses, fears, and possibilities of streets to exercise the right to difference and social inclusion. So this further motivated me to ask myself about Ciclovía. And later on in her book, she is recounting how women were perceived in Ciclovía during the 1980s. And I came across this quote that I wanted to share with you because it's just so, it motivates me even more to want to study Ciclovía. So she says, the idea of admiring beautiful women during that time, the 1980s, would be one of the meanings that this space would have in the city. However, already in the 80s, the symbolic meaning of women as an object of publicity is notable. Gender studies have demonstrated how historically the street has been a space not apt for women and children because it has been considered dangerous. However, Ciclovía would be promoted as a space for the family and safe. Hence, the massive assistance of women would corroborate this emergency. However, on one hand, Ciclovía opens the possibility for women to access the street as a public space, but on the other hand, it converts them into an attraction on Sundays. So we have a scenario here in the 1980s where clearly like mainstream urban feminism hasn't caught on and women are just seen as part of what is attractive about Ciclovía. You go and you see beautiful women wearing spandex, riding their bicycles, skating, and obviously we need to change this narrative and we need to inquire about what women are actually doing in Ciclovía. So I asked myself, what factors are shaping women's participation and well-being in Ciclovía, with the aim of understanding the conditions that express themselves as barriers, facilitators, and configurations of well-being surrounded women's participation in Ciclovía. My starting point here is that we need to understand well-being in a more complex and sophisticated way, not just as the ability to participate in physical activity, but the interactions between women and other people, between women and the city, between women amongst themselves and other participants, both human and non-human in Ciclovía. So I come from geography, and so my question is, how does geography matter for women's experiences in Ciclovía? The first thing that we did was a survey. I have never done survey methods or quantitative methods before, so my colleague Álvaro Rodriguez from the Department of Engineering has been of great help undertaking this task. We surveyed 509 people, including 283 women and 224 men. We wanted our sample to be representative of the different income sectors in Colombia, in Bogotá, and representative of the gender division of the population in Bogotá. And we surveyed only adults from 18 onwards. So we don't really have that many conclusions yet. So what I'm going to show you are just some of the preliminary results of the survey we undertook. The survey had several parts. It was really long. We asked people about their general attitudes towards physical activity and outdoor activities to see if maybe the predisposition to enjoy exercise is shaping women's decision and desire to attend Ciclovía. We asked them about different attitudes towards Ciclovía. Do they think it's good for the city? Do they think it's an obstacle for traffic and it shouldn't exist? Do they think it promotes well-being? Then we asked them about the different things that may enable or not enable them to participate. For instance, liking Ciclovía, having the possibility of attending, whether the streets to get to Ciclovía from their house are safe or not. We asked them about, here's our paper version of the survey. We asked them about the first time they went, how often they go, what they do, how they mobilize around Ciclovía, who they participate with, the different elements they have at their disposition, whether they have skates, skateboards, bicycles, etc. And finally, we asked them about their experiences in terms of safety, in terms of perceptions of the environment, in terms of how they read, the signaling in Ciclovía. Are the signs clear? Do they know how to get to and from their house to Ciclovía, etc.? And these are some of the things that we found. So first, how many women are participating in Ciclovía? We found that 90% of our surveyed women had participated at least once, which is a relief. We asked them when they participated for the first time, and most of them started, between 1 year and 10 years ago. And when we asked them why they have never participated, some commented that it was due to poor cycling abilities, that they don't have a bicycle, or a lack of time. And I think this is interesting, because you don't need a bicycle to go to Ciclovía, right? But this tells us that for a lot of people, there is an association that Ciclovía is a space for cycling. So perhaps there is a need to better communicate that there are many things that you can do in Ciclovía for which you don't need a bicycle. You can go and walk, you can go and skate, you can go and jog, you can just go and use it to connect to your nearest public park, have a picnic, whatever. But there is a perception that Ciclovía is bicycles. And I think that's something that needs to be changed in the discourse if we're going to be more inviting for women who might be more hesitant to cycle. We asked them if they have participated in the last 6 months, and around 62% of women had participated in the last 6 months. And when we asked them why they hadn't participated, they said lack of time, that they were doing other leisurely activities, that they don't have a bicycle, that they work on Sundays, or due to health concerns. And I've included here a small graph where we asked them to take all the activities that they did on the previous Sunday, and we see a very clear difference between men and women. So we see that a lot more women were doing household work than men. A lot more women were doing taking care of themselves, cuidado personal, like personal care of themselves, than men. And other social and cultural activities. We wanted to see if maybe people were busy going to church instead of going to Ciclovía, which is something that could happen. We also found that women were doing non-sportive activities and, of course, taking care of other people, which is something you can do in Ciclovía, but it depends on what it is you're doing with that other person. So clearly, women are busy doing many other things on Sundays, and this may be limiting their participation in Ciclovía. So how often are they participating? So the blue is women and the orange is men. This confuses me a little bit. Women are sporadic users of Ciclovía. They go between 1 and 3 times a month, whereas men are more inclined to go every Sunday to Ciclovía. We have here rarely, and we see that a lot more women than men rarely go to Ciclovía. So they're participating less frequently than men. And I've put the slide in yellow just to signal it to you. When we asked them to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 how much they agree with the statement of I would like to participate more often, Well, it's quite pleasant to see that both women and men would like to participate more often in Ciclovía. Men would like to participate slightly more than women, but it's still there, you know, around 75% of women would like to participate more often in Ciclovía, and they're either fully agree or agree with this statement. We asked them if attending Ciclovía is within their possibilities. Do they have time? Do they have the means? And here we find a slight variation between men and women, but still the majority of women have within their possibilities to go to Ciclovía. So the follow-up question is, well, why aren't they going more? And this is something we're going to find out in the next stage of the research. We asked them if they have time to go to Ciclovía on Sundays, and surprisingly, a lot of women do have time. So they're choosing to do other activities, and I think it's a matter of figuring out how they're making that decision, how they're juggling between the different things that they could do on a Sunday. We asked them to rate the statement. Sorry.
I hate to cut you off, but I want to just let you know that we got to move into our Q&A soon. And since we get to have you in our breakout session, you'll be able to share some more slides there if we don't get to them. But just,
so am I out of time, or do I have a couple of more minutes?
Let's wrap it up.
Okay, so let me jump to uses of Ciclovía, because this is where we found the most important differences. Women are going to walk to Ciclovía more so than men, and they like to skate more than men. And this is, for me, the most interesting part of the survey that we did. When we asked them what activities they partake in, we find that socializing with friends and family stands out amongst other activities that women are engaging in. And they tend to participate more with other people than men do. So they go either with their partners, with their children, with other family members, with their pets, which I think is really significant to highlight Ciclovía as a multi-species space, and with their parents. So I think it's really interesting to find that Ciclovía is a space that women find apt for sociability. And I have just some few preliminary observations, not conclusions. Most women have had a positive experience of Ciclovía. They feel safe, but fear of sexual harassment continues to affect women's participation in these kinds of activities. Women's participation may be increasing since the time of the last survey. But their participation is quantitatively and qualitatively different from men, participating less frequently. They walk and skate and more than men and cycle less than men. And it's a space of sociability. So we have some questions that we are going to continue to comb through the data to answer and complement with some in-depth interviews in the coming months. What makes people, and especially women, want to go to Ciclovía? What role do attitudes towards physical activity play? What difference do age and stage in the life course make? Did you have a baby and suddenly you can't go anymore for whatever reason? Do you have an elderly family member that you have to take care of? What role does environment, including proximity, play? Is it perceived as safe? Is it perceived as dirty? So how does the environmental configuration affect participation? Are opportunities to participate equal? And how do they understand well-being? And how does Ciclovía contribute to women's well-being? With the understanding that, again, well-being might not just be physical activity, but a sense of empowerment, a sense of connection with the city, a sense of connection with other people, feeling the sunshine on your face. So sort of ask, how are women understanding well-being? And does that well-being come into being during Ciclovía? So that's it for me. I'm sorry that I extended myself.
No apologies. The research is fantastic, and I'm excited that we get to see more develop and
For sure.
with the follow-up. And I did also want to note that for folks who are interested in the Ciclovía 50 anniversary that's happening in December, keep an eye out, because there will be more information coming out about that as projects develop. And Paula and Sergio are both involved in organizing some of the participatory side of that work. So I just wanted to mention that. So Paula, Olga, Sergio, thank you so much for your presentations. Aaron, thank you so much for our short dialogue. We're now going to go into a Q&A session led by my colleague at UCLA ITS, Deputy Director Juan Matute. So, and as a reminder, Aaron and Paula will be joining me in the breakout session after our next session, so we can have more conversation there.
Thank you, Adonia. We have a couple of questions in the chat. If you have questions, or not in the chat, but in the Q&A feature, if you have questions, please go to your Zoom window and click the Q&A button. where you can view questions that have already been asked as well as pose your own. Just given that our last presentation was from Paula, I would start with questions for her. So first, from Susan Stobner, asking, was safety or feel unsafe offered as an option to survey participants to understand obstacles to their participating more often?
Yeah, so we asked them to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 the statement, I feel safe in Ciclovía. I can't see myself on the screen and it's making me a little bit anxious. Okay, there I am. So we asked them to rate the statement, I feel safe in Ciclovía. 60% of women reported being either totally agree or agree with the statement, I feel safe in Ciclovía. So there's still 40% who neither agree nor disagree, who disagree or who totally disagree. So that's not an insignificant figure. 40% of women are not sure whether they feel safe in Ciclovía or not. We also differentiated between personal safety and road safety. And we found that women are a little bit more fearful of vehicles on the way to Ciclovía, to access the corridors of Ciclovía. We found that both men and women find that the presence of other people makes Ciclovía a safe environment, but the speed at which people, go around Ciclovía emerges as an element of feeling unsafe. So for many people, it's, I'm afraid that somebody is going to cycle past and run me over or make me lose my balance and fall. So there's different ways of understanding safety, and we took all of them into account. So I would generally say that this does emerge as one of the, concerns of why women participate less, even though Ciclovía is perceived to be a safe environment. So maybe it's not Ciclovía itself, but the access to Ciclovía or elements that are not about, I'm going to get robbed, I'm going to get raped, but somebody might make me fall or somebody might run over my kid. These are things that we still need to, my colleague who is an engineer and does all these maths things will find a correlation in between these elements and we'll figure out to what extent this has an influence in women going or not.
Okay. And I will shift to a question from Olga. For Olga, this is from Alejandro Manga with WPI. What do we know about the relationship between the COVID bike lanes that were turned permanent and socioeconomic conditions?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Most of the ones that became permanent are in middle and high SES areas, but most of the individuals that use them are in low to middle income SES. There were 80 kilometers that were temporary, but only 25 became permanent. So it's still most of the individuals that use their bikes for transport is more low SES because it's more out of necessity, different from what we see on Ciclovía.
Okay, I'm told my audio was a little low. Is it better now?
I hear you well.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Bryn of Climate Resolve asking, in what ways have open streets events been responsive to the increasing hazards of extreme heat? Presumably due to a changing climate. Is this something that's been a consideration?
Well, I can take that one. Juan, we haven't studied climate variability and the potential effect of Ciclovía. Actually, Ciclovía, when you change vehicles like cars, buses, by individuals who have clean transport, you are more likely to decrease the emissions of CO2, but we haven't studied that. We have a very small study, and I know the ones that have studied more are you in LA on air pollution, but not on heat islands, not on temperature. For that, we will need to have more local data around the corridors. But in theory, you will have a clean modes of transportations compared to diesel or the other automobiles that use that type of combustion. You have, Paula, you.
Paula?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that these are the kinds of conversations that need to get going around Ciclovía, that I think a lot of people, at least here in Bogotá, take for granted. The link between these kinds of events and the urgent climate response that we need to be having. So I think this 50th anniversary is a wonderful opportunity to explicitly make the connection with and for people. Ciclovía relates to climate issues and conversations, and we really need to get this ball going.
Okay. So this question, I believe, is for Paula, but others may have perspectives on it. We have a question from Susan, and wondering about other populations that may be feel vulnerable being more visible as part of these events. So particularly wondering if there may be a correlation between a woman's experience in participating and those who are LGBTQ plus.
Yeah, I think there might definitely be a relationship. We didn't ask about sexuality in the survey, but I think this is a really, really relevant question for follow-up research, or even to include during the interview stage of the research project, because obviously for LGBTQ people, public space has been even more unwelcoming than it has been for women. So thank you, Susan, for that question.
I mean, if I could say, I think in Los Angeles, like, I think the societal context also has a role in this, and I think that Ciclovía is perceived, and it would be interesting that more research needs to be done on this, but I do think it's perceived as a very safe space by all parties, LGBTQ, people with different disabilities. You really see this great expression of Los Angeles and all of its diversity at Ciclovía here.
Thank you, Paula and Aaron. And I think just one more question before we go into break. And that is just these barriers that women and under gender minorities experience. Do these represent similar barriers to involvement in community generally? So is what we're seeing in Ciclovía representative of greater societal factors?
Okay, so first I just want to say that women are not a minority. We're actually the majority of the world. To be honest with you, I don't know. I don't know, because I feel that, okay, on the one hand, as I highlighted, the previous studies that I consulted showed that only 30% of participants were women. And we do know that women have less time for involvement in things like leisure, recreation, volunteering, community activities in general, owing to like the double and triple shifts of both paid and unpaid work. And I think across the world, this constitutes the largest barriers for women involvement in politics and other kinds of social life. So, I mean, I would expect that the answer is yes, but I would not venture to say like, yes, definitely that is the case.
Okay.
One, in the complementary programs, that's why, as Aaron said, we need to reinvent all the time these programs, and we need to know that it's not only the corridor. So there's a lot of opportunity around the corridor. In the complementary programs, you see more diversity. And I always applaud what Bogotá did, and was actually Lucy Barriga, which was bringing a program understanding the preferences of women. Women, we love dancing. We prefer dancing than biking. So I don't think we should force everybody to bike or to rollerblade or to walk on the corridor. If we like dancing, many of our LGBTQ population like also dancing and reinventing dancing. Those are the type of strategies that are community-based, that are born from the community preferences, that should be implemented for being more inclusive in Ciclovía. In Ciclovía program as a whole program, which is not only the corridor.
Okay.
Can I add something? Because I think there's also a very interesting understanding of Ciclovía depending of who is experiencing it, right? So like we're talking a lot about women might be experiencing differently Ciclovía than men, but also it's an element of class. Like there's like a lot of studies that show, for instance, that people in the north of the city, which is like richer, use Ciclovía in a more kind of like a sporty way, to sort of like with bikes and more like as a sport. And then in the south of the city, it's more like a family issue where families hang out. So I think what is interesting about Ciclovía is there's also this allows for the mixing of different classes in a city that is very segregated. But again, if one looks at it through the class lens, then sees this kind of things, that if you look at it from a gender perspective, would be different. One perspective which I haven't really seen in any dialogue or academic research is on race, for instance. That would be interesting to maybe to one study that we haven't done, or I have not seen any. So yeah, I think there's still like so many things, like Ciclovía in a way reflects the complexities of public space. And so there's so many things that we can experience and learn about it.
Lots of outstanding questions for additional research of how we learn about society through these events. We're going to go to break now and reconvene in 5 minutes at 35 minutes after the hour. So we do have some questions that pertain to LA, and after the break, we will be looking into an LA case study. So we will be back in 5 minutes.
Welcome back to those who are returning from our unfortunately very short break. Thank you all for your patience as we, of course, in real time end up having more to say. There's always such good spillover from these conversations. But we are really excited to move into our next segment when we return from break. Do we have our roundtable participants back in the room? We're looking for Frank, Ramel, Tafari, and Jimmy. I see Frank spotlighted. I see Ramel. I'm going to start doing introductions to this next section and a little bit about our speakers. So this session is going to be a roundtable discussion focused on our case study here in LA of Open Street, Ciclovía, which started on October 10th, 2010, and now has been going for almost 14 very successful years. And we are super fortunate to get to have in this conversation Romel Pascual, the executive director of Ciclovía. We have Frank Ching, who is a deputy executive officer at LA Metro. We have Tafari Bain, the chief strategist at Ciclovía, and Jimmy Lizama, who's the founder of Reciclos. And this conversation is going to highlight some of the different phases that a successful event goes through in terms of kind of like its origin, what are the skill sets that have been involved, and then how do we really ensure that there is strong support for participation across different elements to keep the event strong. So specifically thinking about the community capacity, the political work, the cultural work of activation, and the urban planning components that have all been part of LA's experience. And we get to have in our group of speakers here really good insight into those different elements. And thank you all for joining us. And then when we go into the breakouts later on, we're going to organize things with Ramel and Frank in one room to talk more about the political and planning components, and Tafari and Jimmy will be in another room to talk more about community and cultural components. So without further ado, thanks everybody. So let's kind of get started with a go round on what has been your role in Ciclovía in LA, and how does that build on your past experiences and expertise? What kind of brought you to be part of this event? Let's start with Ramel.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Romel Pascual with Ciclovía. it started pretty early on, when in listening and having met with the visionaries and founders or co-founders of Ciclovía when I was in City Hall, with Adonia, Aaron, and many others in the room, and then serving as deputy mayor, to really become that implementation partner as we move forward into Ciclovía. And most of my background has been in community organizing and political work, and now heading up one of the most amazing organizations in the world, Ciclovía.
Thank you, Ramel. Let's go to Frank and then Jimmy and then Tafari.
Hi, everybody. Frank Ching here. I work for LA Metro, and my role with Ciclovía, in more specific, I'm actually the administrator of the program called Open Street Program for LA Metro. It's a grant program that we administrate. Metro have allocated funding resource to help different cities or different region council of governments, the COGS, to produce this type of event. We are the funding, the resources supporting it. We investing on this type of event to further promote sustainable and well-being type of active transportation. And the experience and the mobility experience is why we investing on it. And I'm the one who administrated the program. I took over the program 6 years ago. 6 years ago, this program been exists. This is the year 9th and 10th. So I took over the program about 6 years ago. And since then, worked with Romel to participate and attend in every Ciclovía that, throughout, the city. And I guess the role of why Metro will be as a transit agency is a good role of investing on this type of events. It's because of community, because of the culture, and also because Metro is the agency of County 1. So we actually able to support and to successful more than just one city, but then more like in different part of the county, able to experience this type of open street. And latest thing is that since last cycle, we also encouraging the closed street initiative too, which means the closed street is multiple days of closing the street. And we can describe it as multiple days of Ciclovía instead of just 1 day, hours of the event. So that's the role that I'm in right now, and I'll pass it to the next person.
And just to follow up on that real quick, Frank, so the distinction is, so Ciclovía is City of LA, right? But Metro as a county agency is doing work with open street events in different cities. For example, Arroyo Fest, the really exciting event that recently closed the 110 freeway, would that count as one of those other events?
Correct. Okay. Correct. Different part of the county that we support.
Excellent. Okay, let's go to Jimmy.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Adonia, and everybody for having me here today to speak a little bit. My specific engagement and relationship to Ciclovía has been mostly indirect, and most recently it's become a lot more direct, and I'm definitely experiencing moments where I'm seeing a collaboration with the work that I do and Ciclovía that can be a great partnership in so many different ways, especially after this conversation. So I am also the founder of the Bicycle Kitchen, and I think that's really where I come in most strongly in terms of my relationship to Ciclovía, in that when I started the Bicycle Kitchen out of a kitchen of the LA Eco Village, which is like a breeding ground for a lot of bicycle advocacy, walking advocacy, and just social activism in Koreatown of LA, I kind of informally started the Bicycle Kitchen, and at that point, I knew everybody who was on a bicycle in the general like 5 to 10 mile radius. So, and the difference in terms of like the people that I was talking to culturally was that the folks on these bicycles were folks who were doing urban transportation and socializing, and the bicycle was the vehicle to do that, right? Different from mountain bikers and roadies out there. So very different from recreation to like social engagement. So I knew those folks on a regular basis because they would come over to my place. at the Eco Village and a half pizza that I would make for them, and we'd hang out and do the bicycle kitchen hangout thing. That blossomed into a small organization of 30 people deep of volunteers with a small grant that we moved into a more public space a few blocks away, which then blossomed into a culture of riding bicycles in a general area here in LA that took a stronghold where there really wasn't one before, where folks were talking to each other about getting around. So in a sense, it was like we started to create a bicycle culture in LA that then also helped inform why there might be people going to a Ciclovía down the line. And I think that the bicycle kitchen was really instrumental in having a loving and harnessing space for folks to talk about these things and envision a different LA. So I would say that Ciclovía was also a place where the bicycle kitchen helped create those visions and have a good place to talk about them and support of a community to do that. Today, I have a thing called El Bicicrófono, which is a mobile karaoke performing stage. And this is kind of further digging deep into the cultural engagement that we need to lead people to that water source of a future LA where cars are not the means that we use to get around, but rather like people power is the way that we get around. So that's kind of like where I am at the moment with Ciclovía. And I'll stop there for now. Pass it on to Tafari.
Hey everybody, great dialogue today, and thanks so much for organizing this. My name is Tafari Bain, Chief Strategist at Ciclovía. I came to the organization, the nonprofit, first I was a community organizer in South Los Angeles. I grew up, born and raised in South Central Los Angeles, and I was doing housing, anti-gentrification, community organizing, and organizing around development and equity issues. A lot of our community, I personally commuter bikes. Like growing up in a poor family, we didn't have car. My parents couldn't buy me a car in my teens, and I got into my 20s, still couldn't afford it because I was working in a nonprofit sector. They don't pay that much. So I essentially was biking on my 20s, getting back to work. And so I biked as a kid, so it was part of my personality in ways. But I wasn't like Jimmy, really steeped in the bike movement at that point. I was more commuting, biking, and doing my community organizing work. I saw the first, I wasn't involved in the founding of the first event. And so I saw it in the paper. I remember seeing the ad for it in the LA Weekly. Shout out to Aaron Paley's great event promotion and production work, because, I just saw this great event with this great picture. And I was like, this looks like a really powerful thing. I just remember looking at it and saying, this could be an interesting thing to do in South LA, a neighborhood that has no parks, that doesn't have safe streets to bike. And I experienced that daily trying to get to work. And I attended the event. I remember telling my boss at the time at the nonprofit I worked for, Trust South LA, I remember telling her, hey, I think this could be a cool program to look at exploring doing in South LA, but I want to go check it out and see what they're doing exactly. I attended the first event and was completely blown away. I growing up in LA, I've been on all the streets we were on for that first route millions of times, but that time felt like the first time I rode that street. And the interactions and experience and seeing other Angelenos smiling and seeing, how we could use our city, I was immediately inspired. I went straight home from that first event, tracked down the organizers, connected with Aaron, connected with Adonia, connected with Joe Linton, who was one of the street on the ground organizers at the time for the project, and basically became a gadfly. Like, hey, I went to South LA, and it was a really bold kind of thing to do up front, because it wasn't a program, it wasn't a nonprofit yet, it wasn't an organization, it was just an idea. But I really wanted to make sure that there was up front, there was a real conversation about what this could mean to working class communities and low income communities. Because oftentimes when it comes to issues of equity and these kinds of things, neighborhoods like the neighborhood I grew up in don't get cool stuff. And so I knew it would require a loud voice to sort of ensure that this was a program that was going to be everywhere, not just in the more affluent parts of LA. Because much like Bogotá, you can look at LA's geography and see a lot of segregation economically and racially. And it was really important to me to bring that conversation to the fore. And luckily, the organizers for the organization were open to it. And me being a patient kind of person, got involved early, joined the board of directors, and helped start the nonprofit that Ciclovía eventually became. You know, that kind of got me engaged in the organization from jump, going from board to a consultant, helping organize the event, to becoming a full-time staff person and chief strategist. So that's kind of how I came to the work.
That's great. Appreciate all that background. And you know, it really makes me think about this theme of, you know, do you need a bicycle to go to an open street event? Are they about bicycles? And, you know, here in LA, as Jimmy was saying, there was this very strong public bike culture that was happening, right? Like people going on group rides, the bike kitchen, the midnight rides, critical mass had so much to do with that, really creating this visible, you know, people out there, right? Bodies taking up space in the street. And I think in our early conversations about what Ciclovía could look like, we wanted to build on that. It was like, we want to have that be part of this here, and also create a space that includes people who wouldn't see themselves reflected in that, right? Or who wouldn't be, you know, thinking of themselves as someone who's going to go on a group bike ride. And, you know, and I saw a comment from Diane Velez in the chat earlier. I believe Diane is with Active SGV, which produced Arroyo Fest recently, just talking about how, you know, the more that we can think with bicycles, but also beyond bicycles, right? And we're talking about creating these like living spaces, these spaces for people flourishing in the streets. And it really gets to what you're saying, Tafari, in terms of these other aspects of when we're talking about neighborhoods that are disinvested, and all the inequities that are part of our public space and our landscapes. I just really appreciate the way that that track is so much a core part of Ciclovía. So to that point, I'm kind of curious to hear, you know, what how the event takes shape differently in different parts of the city, like how you kind of attend to that, right? Because it's such a diverse place. And you know, curious to hear from the organizers, and you know, on the metro side, and then Jimmy, what you've seen with Bicicrófono, like what kind of changes as it takes place in different areas.
Drew, I can really address that. You know, Ciclovi, you know, we are a nonprofit organization and an amazing team, an amazing set of board members. You know, we're at number 54 in terms of the number of Ciclovi events we've done. And when you think about that, now LA is at almost every 5 weeks, there is an open streets event. And, you know, LA, certainly in the region, and let's start with the city of LA, is a city of communities. We have more than 120 distinct neighborhoods, right? With Hollywood, South LA, Watts, Pacoima, East LA. You can just keep on going. And one of the main questions, or one of the first questions a lot of folks ask when you meet them is, where are you from, right? Which part of LA or the county are you from? And you don't generally say LA. You kind of say the community in which you live in. Internationally, you say you're from LA, but when you're in LA, you say your neighborhood. And you know, it's interesting. Early on, I think it was Sergio that mentioned, you know, the impetus of Ciclovía was this oil crisis, right? And we have to remember the environment in which Ciclovía started in LA, with Adonia and Aaron really leading the charge. It was during a time of recession, right? It was this time where folks were feeling kind of down. Unemployment rates were really high. We were getting into the housing crisis and all of those things that really affected our relational state. And LA is a very relational city. And the very first Ciclovía that happened in October 10th, 2010, really was that moment where you realize we want to be together. There was this relationship orientation. And for those who can remember back to 2010, that was before a lot of the social media, social media connections that we had for understanding what events to go to and where to go. And, you know, we had tens and tens of thousands of folks. And that first, you know, that morning when I was there with, you know, certainly with many other folks, you realize there's something magical here. And so as we progressed in our work, we realized that many more communities needed to have this kind of experience. And our work in really going into different parts of LA is a very deliberate, a deliberate decision on our part, on the staff part, on the board of directors part, to say that LA is not just about these places that we know in a popularity sense, right? Hollywood, Venice, those types of communities, but they're communities that are about, Lincoln Heights. Their communities are about Pacoima, South LA, South Central LA, Watts. And so we now have anchor communities. Over time, we have Heart of LA, which is, as you know, the very first one. We have South LA as our anchor communities. But in any one Ciclovia, we can go through 10 different neighborhoods in any one community, in any one event. And so how we choose our routes are really based on, obviously, some of which is topography. LA, surprisingly, is a hilly city, but it's also one that is a dynamically diverse city. And we have so many communities to choose from and to be part of. And we've been to 70 of the 120 neighborhoods. And so, we will continue to go in places and communities that lack the resources and the access to open space, and to provide this benefit that Ciclovia has. So we are deliberate about where we go.
If I can jump in real quick, kind of like piggybacking up what Romel's saying, there was an unintended experience I had at this last Ciclovia. And I'm really happy that as I was going into it, I was really feeling it very deeply. So the bicicrofono is a thing that weighs like 500 pounds all by itself. And it has no suspension on it. So our relationship with the actual street, the actual pavement that's happening, is very, very personal, very, very intimate, because we have to obviously be careful of this giant thing. So as I was going into South LA with the bicicrofono this last Sunday, I was completely thinking about, okay, I'm about to experience the equity of infrastructure on these streets down Western Avenue, right? And see what that feels like. And truthfully, I've been to the other parts of the city with bicicrofono, and you literally feel the equity of what's being taken care of and what is it. So when you talk about what communities we're going to, Ciclovia definitely is that relationship, that conversation, right? When you're biking, when you're walking. The other thing I noticed too, down in South LA, was the lack of trees, right? And how hot that was. It was already hot, right? So even more, Ciclovia speaks to the resources that are being put into those communities. The third thing that I noticed in that experience was what bicycling does, what walking does, what walking to transportation does, versus the car experience. And I'm an Angelino. I'm from K-Town. I've been here 50 years almost. I've never had a car, and I'm so thankful that I've never had a car, because I think that the thing that I saw was that I saw the community. I saw Western for 100 blocks. I saw Western in a way that I'm sure mostly every single day we don't have an honest conversation about what the community is experiencing, because we're not walking it, we're not biking it. So the beauty of Ciclovia and the beauty of just simply walking and biking in general is an honest discussion with community. So that's another place that definitely that I feel strongly that Ciclovia can really help out some more and talk to people about what's actually going on in the resources. And I'm sure we can get into that a little deeper, but I'll stop there.
No, I just wanted to riff off that a bit, because I in my organizing work prior to my engagement with Ciclovia and up to this day, really, using the bicycle and walking as tools for urban planning and engagement, giving people a sense of place and giving people a sense of what's possible, it's always been a strong undercurrent of the work, I believe, and it's one of the things that we've tried to push in our work with Ciclovia. We know that when people are engaging in the streets in this way, they are open to new possibilities and also learning things about their space. So how do you take those conversations and then evolve them into actual dialogues around actually changing the neighborhood directly and actually improving communities directly? Has been a big undercurrent for our work in this last phase, and that manifests at our events through the nonprofits that we invite to engage, the organizations in the community, and the projects that are happening in the community that engage at our events, at our hubs. I mean, these are literally booths and activations that allow people to do outreach and engagement and education around the work they're doing in communities. And ensuring a culture is really represented at the event, right? To Adonia's original question around, what is dealing with a diverse city, what does dealing with these different communities mean to the event? It means really providing a platform and a stage so that folks can have the conversations they want about the neighborhoods, and also to express who they are in their communities, so that, people learn about other people, and learn about the communities we're going in, which I think is an important part of how we ensure these events, open street events, don't become displacement tools and tools for gentrification. Whenever you do nice stuff in neighborhoods, in capitalism, unfortunately, whenever you do nice stuff in neighborhoods, it can lead to rising rents and people having to move out. But when you tie these nice things to the people who actually live there, where they get to express themselves, where they get to actually push economy and do business, right? Like to have their business out in the street, to their small businesses be supported by these activities, to have the opportunity to pop up and do street vending, to other kinds of economy. These are ways that these activities are helping to invest in those people, right? And that investment helps breed stability, it helps people stay in place, and helps build stronger communities as a whole. And so I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do now, is really ensure that the Open Street event is about the community that it's in, and is an opportunity for that community to strengthen itself and grow. And I think that's an important aspect of this work moving forward.
Yeah, let me add one thing is, at a Ciclovia day, you see the outward facing component of the work, but behind the scenes, the weeks and months that, leads up to any one of the Ciclovia events, we have such an amazing group of folks with Rachel and Arian leading the production team, which is being on the ground way ahead of time to be able to, we door knock, along the entire route twice, with our outreach team, to make sure that folks are not caught off guard and see the opportunity of a Ciclovia, both from a local economic development perspective, also from a marketing perspective, from a community priority engagement perspective. So a lot of that work happens folks don't see that, right? And it's because of that work that allows us to create these relationships with folks. And even to the point where businesses will call us and say, thank you, that was the second busiest day we've ever had in our 20-year history. And we'd say, what is your first busiest, most busy? Oh, the last time you came, right? And so I think there's a lot of, we have to understand that the work that goes into it, you get to see the benefits on a Ciclovia day. And so it just reinforces that the relational aspect. We talked about environments in which Ciclovias emerged from oil crisis to recession, and then we had the pandemic, and we couldn't be on the ground. You see a picture of Ciclovia with thousands of people. That was like, no, you can't have that kind of gathering. But our relationship with community and businesses allowed us to help lead and elevate the alfresco program within the city, because we had that relationship, right? We had that relationship going into restaurants and saying, we are with Ciclovia, we get a hug, and we're helping with alfresco elevated. And so you realize that importance of conversation. And that's really the baseline of our work. Partnership and conversation allows you to do so many other things.
Yeah.
I'm going to give Frank the last word here in this session, and then we're going to split into breakout. So go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, for our Open Street program, we have covered 38 different jurisdictions and invested on over 248 miles of these type of events. I think for us, what we look at the value is because we adopt our criteria of how to select who we invest and which event we select to invest on. First of all, we want to make sure we're able to help new people, more people to participate, new faces to participate, to experience, take the street back and motivate them to get out of their car, right? That's part of my job, right? And also the equity value and the civic engagement from our agency, what we can put it into. That's kind of important to us because I run other programs too. And it's actually through Ciclovia that I have learned from someone that I love this event, but every time I come here, I walk. Yeah, walking is part of the active transportation,
but I have to walk because I can't afford a bicycle. So that inspired me to develop another program that I'm probably not going to mention here, and Jimmy's my partner in crime here. So the thing is the equity value that what we have learned and what we have been able to invest on, and also the civic engagement to find out, to let people know what we have and what they can bring to this multimodal transportation mode, other than just drive from point A to point B. It's why we invest a lot on these type of events too.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for sharing some quick thoughts. We're going to go ahead and transition now into our breakout session. So Phoebe, if we could get that slide up when you have a chance so people know where they're going. Really appreciate Frank, Ramel, Tafari, and Jimmy kind of helping to get the conversation started in terms of the 2 breakout spaces that they'll be in. And Avital from Metro, thank you for sharing a link to the program that Frank mentioned about getting people free bikes. That's in the chat. So our 3 sessions, breakout number 1 is going to be talking about the politics and planning sides of Ciclovía, or how people could translate that into their context. That is going to be moderated by Juan, our deputy director, and that is where Frank and Romel will be. Breakout room number 2 will be focusing on community and cultural activations of Ciclovía spaces. Our moderator will be Andres F. Ramirez, who is a Bogotano and also a PhD in planning student at UCLA. And Jimmy and Tafari will be in that space. And then in the 3rd room, it will be me and Aaron continuing the conversation. Unfortunately, Paula had a pet emergency and had to take off. So it'll be me and Aaron in there in room number 3. But we just so appreciate everybody who was here today for this first mini symposium that we are doing as UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. So I want to thank all of our speakers, Aaron, Sergio, Olga, Paula, and Frank, Romel, Jimmy, and Tafari. Thanks to our moderators, Juan and Andres. Many thanks to Phoebe too, who is my colleague at UCLA ITS and did tremendous work to bring this all together. Other colleagues, Whitney Willis and Claudia Bustamante, also did great work to put it together. So really appreciate it. If we can go to our sponsor slide, we'll just thank them again. And then next slide, we are going to be continuing this conversation in a few ways. One is at the Lake Arrowhead Symposium that will take place in October. It is going to be looking at the transportation, land use, and environment connection. It's what we usually do there. The theme is very much in development, but something that we haven't publicly launched yet. We're also going to try having another online mini symposium later this year that's going to focus on transit and labor. It's going to be organized by my ITS colleague, Jacob Wasserman, so we're looking forward to that. Let's go to the next slide where folks can see how to sign up for our mailing list. If you want to learn more about what's happening at the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, we'd be happy to have you on there. I came away from this with some really great research questions that we can be developing, lots of follow-up to do with folks at Metro, at Ciclovía, at CARS, all these different components. And we hope that you learned something today and got to meet or see somebody new. And thank you so much for joining us.